Welcome back to Talk Tensors, where we take deep dives into machine learning research.
That's right.
And today we've got a really interesting paper, I think, called Everybody Likes to Sleep,
Yeah.
a computer-assisted comparison of object naming data from 30 languages.
Catchy title.
Yeah, it is catchy.
Yeah, as we'll find out, it's a kind of a hint at one of the interesting findings.
It is, yeah, it's a great title. So this paper looks at how humans name objects, which, sounds kind of simple,
Yeah,
but it's actually really complex.
it is.
So before we jump into all the details, why don't we talk about why is this research important for machine learning?
Yeah, so the researchers are really focused on these things called object naming datasets. And these datasets are essentially collections of images and their corresponding names.
Okay.
And they're used in lots of different fields like psycholinguistics and machine learning.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and the problem is that these datasets can be quite idiosyncratic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So each data set is kind of like its own little world.
Yeah, they're often kind of put together in isolation without much consistency in how those objects are chosen or even named.
Interesting.
So it makes it really difficult to compare findings across different studies, particularly across languages.
So you're saying that, like, if you're trying to train a machine learning model to recognize objects, but the data you're using to train it is all over the place, it's not going to be very accurate.
Exactly. It's like trying to bake a cake with mismatched ingredients in a wonky oven.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
You're not going to get a very good cake.
No.
So that's the challenge the researchers set out to address in this paper. They wanted to create a way to make these data sets more comparable so we can get a clearer picture of how object naming works across different languages and cultures.
That makes a lot of sense. So how did they tackle this challenge?
Well, they gathered 17 different object naming data sets,
Wow.
covering 30 languages from 10 different language families.
Okay.
And then to create a common ground for comparison, they linked all the concepts in these data sets to a standardized system called Concepticon.
Okay, so Concepticon is kind of like a universal translator for these data sets.
Precisely.
Okay.
It allows researchers to compare apples to apples even when the data sets use different languages or have different ways of categorizing objects.
Gotcha. And by doing this, they were able to uncover some pretty fascinating insights, right?
Yes, absolutely. One of the most surprising was the lack of what we call basic vocabulary in
Yeah.
these data sets.
Can you explain what you mean by basic vocabulary?
Sure, basic vocabulary refers to the core set of words that are essential for communication in any language.
Got it.
So these are words that represent common objects, actions, and concepts like tree, water, or eat.
Like the foundational building blocks of language.
Exactly. And so it turns out that even the largest data set they analyzed, which had over 1,200 items, only had 37 out of 54 basic vocabulary nouns
Wow, that seems low.
from a classic list developed by linguist Morris Swadesh.
Huh.
So it's a lot smaller than you might expect.
Yeah. You would think those basic words would be pretty well represented.
You would think so, but it really highlights a key takeaway from this research, which is that even when researchers try to create broadly applicable data sets, there's still a lot of variation in what they consider to be basic.
Right.
And that variation could be due to cultural differences, research goals, or even just individual preferences.
So basically, even when we try to be objective, there's still a lot of subjectivity involved.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm.
Okay, so we've talked about the what and the why of this research, but before we get into some of the implications, can we take a step back and talk about how we got here? Like, how did people study object naming before we had these fancy data sets and computational tools?
Well, before these large data sets came along, research on object naming was conducted on a much smaller scale. So think experiments with just a handful of participants using a very limited set of objects.
It's like observing the night sky with the naked eye before the invention of the telescope.
Exactly.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. And then in the mid-20th century, we had a kind of revolution in linguistics and cognitive science. And researchers started to develop more rigorous methods for studying language and thought.
Gotcha.
And this led to the creation of those early standardized sets of images and words for experiments.
Like our telescope.
Exactly like our telescope, to help explore this in a more systematic way.
Okay.
And as technology advanced, those data sets grew larger and more sophisticated.
Makes sense. So now we're at a point where we can analyze massive amounts of data using really powerful computational tools.
Right, and that's what this paper is all about.
Right.
They've taken these existing data sets and connected them in a way that allows for much more robust analysis.
Yeah, it's really taking the field to a whole new level.
It really is.
Okay, so before we jump into potential applications, I'm curious about these psycholinguistic norms that the researchers mentioned. What are those exactly?
Yeah, so psycholinguistic norms are essentially benchmarks that describe how a specific group of people typically perform on a given language task. So in the context of object naming, these norms might include things like the average time it takes someone to name a particular object, the percentage of people who agree on a specific name, or the age at which children typically learn to name a certain object.
So it's like having a reference point
Exactly.
to compare your findings to.
Right. So if you do a study with a small group, you can use these norms to see if your participants are performing similarly to the broader population,
Wait,
or if there's something unique about them.
gotcha. And why are these norms important for this research on object naming data sets?
Well, because remember, object naming isn't just about language.
Right.
It's a complex cognitive process that's influenced by perception, cultural experience, and even the physical world around us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And these psycholinguistic norms offer a way to capture and quantify those influences.
Okay.
So it allows researchers to delve deeper into the interplay of factors that shape how we name objects.
So by incorporating these norms into their analysis, the researchers have essentially created an even more powerful lens for examining those data sets.
Exactly. It's like they've upgraded their telescope to see even further
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
into the universe of object naming.
I like it. So this brings us to the next part of our discussion, which is exploring some potential applications and extensions of this research, especially for machine learning.
Okay.
So what kind of novel notions come to mind when you think about the potential of this work?
Well, for me, the most intriguing aspect is the possibility of developing machine learning models that can recognize objects not just based on their visual features, but also on their cultural significance and contextual usage. So instead of just identifying an image as like a bed, a model could understand that in some cultures, a bed might also be a place for socializing or working or even eating.
Oh, that's interesting. So it could recognize that the concept of bed can have different meanings.
Yeah, different connotations and functions,
Okay.
depending on the cultural context.
Right.
And this could be super valuable for applications like image search or machine translation, where understanding those nuances is really crucial for accuracy.
It would be like teaching a machine to understand not just the dictionary definition of a word, but also like its cultural baggage
Right, exactly.
and the subtle ways that it's used in different contexts.
Yeah, and that level of understanding would be a game changer for developing more human-like AI.
It's like we're talking about giving machines a sense of cultural awareness,
I know, it's pretty exciting.
which has always been considered a human trait.
Yeah, and it all stems from this research on how humans name objects.
Mhm.
By understanding those underlying cognitive processes, we can start to develop algorithms that kind of mimic those processes in machines.
So we're essentially using our knowledge of human cognition to create more intelligent and adaptable AI.
Precisely. And I think that's where the real power of this research lies.
This leads me to another novel notion.
Okay.
What if we could use these linked data sets and psycholinguistic norms to create a sort of cultural fingerprint for different languages?
A cultural fingerprint. That's an interesting idea. Tell me more.
So we know that the objects we choose to name and categorize can reveal a lot about our cultural values and priorities. So by analyzing these data sets, we could potentially identify patterns in how different languages categorize objects.
Okay.
And these patterns could provide a unique fingerprint that reflects the underlying cultural DNA of that language.
So, for example, a language spoken in a predominantly agricultural society might have a more elaborate vocabulary for describing different types of plants or farming tools, whereas a language spoken in a seafaring culture might have a richer lexicon for nautical terms.
Exactly. And those differences could provide valuable insights into the history and the values and even the worldview of those cultures.
It's like we're talking about using data to decode the cultural soul of a language.
And imagine the applications. This kind of cultural fingerprint could be incredibly valuable for fields like anthropology, linguistics, even marketing.
Yeah, I can see it now. Marketing campaigns tailored to the specific cultural fingerprints of different target audiences.
Right? Or imagine being able to use this knowledge to improve cross-cultural communication or to develop more culturally sensitive educational materials.
Yeah, the possibilities are endless.
And it all stems from this simple yet profound question. How do we name the objects around us?
It really does.
Okay, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about a specific finding from the paper that really caught my attention. Remember how the researchers discovered that bed was the only word that appeared in all 17 data sets?
Oh, yes. The everybody likes to sleep phenomenon.
Exactly. It got me thinking about the cultural significance of beds.
Mm.
I mean, it's more than just a piece of furniture, right?
Absolutely.
It's a symbol of rest, comfort, privacy, even vulnerability.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's so consistently represented across these data sets, regardless of language or culture, suggests that it taps into something deeply human.
Yeah. Definitely universal.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if there are other objects or concepts that hold similar universal appeal.
That's a great question. It would be interesting to see if there are other cultural universals that emerge when you analyze these data sets across a wider range of languages and cultures.
And perhaps we could even use this knowledge to bridge cultural divides and foster a greater sense of shared humanity.
Now you're talking. It's like using the language of objects to create a common ground for understanding.
I like that. Okay, let's bring this back to the world of machine learning for a moment. We've talked about how this research could be used to develop more culturally aware models, but what about other potential applications? I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of a cognitive radar that you mentioned earlier.
Ah, yes, the cognitive radar. It's a bit speculative, but I think it has some real potential. Essentially, the idea is to use these object naming datasets and psycholinguistic norms to detect subtle changes in a person's cognitive or emotional state.
Based on their language use.
Based on their language use, exactly.
So if someone starts taking longer to name certain objects, or if they start using unusual names, it could be an early warning sign of cognitive decline.
Yeah, or a change in their emotional well-being.
Interesting.
Exactly. And this cognitive radar could be incredibly valuable in a variety of settings, from mental health clinics to schools to elder care facilities. Imagine being able to detect subtle changes before they become serious problems.
It's like having a non-invasive way to monitor brain health just by analyzing someone's language.
Precisely. And it all stems from this fascinating research on how humans name objects.
Okay, this conversation has really opened my eyes to the incredible potential of this research. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to get your take on something. We've talked a lot about the applications of this work, but what about the ethical considerations? I mean, if we can use language data to create these cultural fingerprints or to monitor cognitive health, doesn't that raise some concerns about privacy and potential misuse?
Yeah, those are all excellent points. You know, any technology that has the potential to reveal such personal information needs to be developed and used responsibly. We need to be very careful about data privacy, informed consent, and potential biases,
It's like we're walking this tightrope between innovation and responsibility.
Exactly.
We want to use these tools for good,
Right.
but we also need to make sure they don't harm or exploit people.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that needs to happen early and often, as this research progresses.
Yeah, we need to involve ethicists and social scientists and policymakers
Everyone, yeah.
to make sure that these technologies are used ethically
For the benefit of all.
for the benefit of all.
Yeah.
Well said. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
from the ins and outs of these data sets to the big implications for machine learning.
It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, it has been. But before we wrap up, I have one more novel notion bouncing around in my head.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
What if we could take this idea of personalized language learning
Right.
and create systems that not only teach new languages,
Uh-huh.
but also help people communicate more effectively within their own language?
That's interesting. How do you envision that working?
So imagine a system that analyzes your language use, identifies areas where you could be more precise
Mm-hmm.
or concise or persuasive. It could offer suggestions for improving your vocabulary, your grammar, even your storytelling abilities.
So it's like a personalized writing coach
Exactly.
or a communication guru in your pocket.
I love it.
It could be so helpful for students, professionals, anyone who wants to improve their communication.
Yeah, and it could even be used to help people with language disorders or learning disabilities.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's a really compelling idea.
It is, and it all builds on this fundamental research on how humans use language.
It really does.
You know, it's amazing to think about how such a simple act, like naming an object,
Right.
can unlock so much potential for innovation and understanding.
It really is. This paper has been a fantastic springboard for exploring the interplay of language, culture, cognition, and technology. And I'm excited to see where this research leads.
Me too. It's clear that the field of object naming is just scratching the surface.
of what's possible. And I have a feeling we'll be talking about this again on Talk Tensors.
I'm sure we will, as new discoveries emerge. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of object naming. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check the show notes for a link to the paper and some additional resources. Until next time, keep those synapses firing.